Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here and joining us for this conversation today. We're going to go ahead and get started. So first of all, my name is David Garcia. I'm the Policy Director at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. I'm really excited to have this conversation today on strategies for conversion of hotels and motels to affordable housing across the country. I also want to plug that we have very similar work coming out soon specifically on Project Home Key in California. So stay tuned for that. We'll have a webinar on that as well. But today I have the privilege of moderating a conversation on national strategies for hotel and motel conversions, framed by our recent research on the same topic. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed and deepened the vulnerability of homeless populations across the United States. Even before the pandemic, we know that more than 500,000 people experienced homelessness on a single night in 2019. About 37% of those were unsheltered. And so these individuals were at much higher risk for transmission of COVID-19, as well as hospitalization and death. So the recognition of this public health crisis led many states and localities to prioritize getting unhoused people off of the street, mainly in the form of non-congregate emergency shelters. So by leasing motels and hotels that were underutilized and empty during the pandemic. So in addition, the availability of federal relief funds led many of these same places and states to develop strategies and approaches to converting these hotels and motels into permanently affordable housing. And so now that we're at the 2-year mark, almost, of the pandemic, we can take a step back and ask, what have we learned from these strategies? How have hotel conversions been successful? Is this something we can scale as a strategy beyond just the pandemic? So to dig into these questions, we have a really great conversation lined up. First, we're going to start with a presentation of our research on this topic by our faculty director, Carolina Reed, Shaji Amanji, our research associates, and a graduate student researcher, Hayden Rosenberg. From there, we'll transition to Mary Tingerthal, who most recently was with the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency and has worked with the National Alliance to End Homelessness on a very similar and complementary study on the same topic. And then following those presentations, we have a great conversation lined up with 3 people who have on-the-ground experience in hotel and motel acquisitions and conversions. And so we are joined by Matt Molika, who is the executive director of the Ending Community Homeless Coalition, or ECHO, in Austin and Travis County. Prior to joining ECHO, Matt served as the vice president of housing assistance for the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. He's also worked in the city of San Francisco with the Public Health Department as their housing coordinator. We're also joined by Christina Moon, who is the Deputy Director for Housing Development for the City of Oakland, where she guides funding strategies and affordable housing production strategies, and has been key as part of the city's Home Key strategy too. Now, Christina's also worked in San Francisco and New York City on similar strategies, and she also has a background in affordable housing. Then we're also joined by Amy Anderson, who is the Senior Vice President with Wells Fargo's Housing Affordability Philanthropy arm, where she helps oversee Wells Fargo's philanthropic support of housing affordability by supporting innovative strategies for increasing supply of homes that are affordable. Amy has spent her entire career in affordable housing, most recently as the Chief Housing Officer for Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, where she represented the mayor's office there in the local implementation of both Project Room Key and then the subsequent Project Home Key projects there too. So before we jump into the presentation, it's just a couple housekeeping items. This presentation will be recorded and available afterwards. We also will save time for question and answers from the audience. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom to participate. I also want to thank our partners who are integral to this research at the Housing Crisis Research Collaborative, which includes some of our peer centers at the Furman Center at NYU, the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, and Urban Institute. And lastly, I will say, and we're pleased that this conversation is co-presented by the American Planning Association's Housing and Community Development Division and is available for 1 CM credit. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Carolina Reed and the Terner Center team to go over our recent paper on acquisition strategy. So Carolina, please take it away.
Thanks so much, David, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us, as well as everybody who is on the webinar today. I'm going to share my screen here for some slides. In our presentation, we're going to give a brief overview of the findings from our recent report addressing homelessness through hotel conversions. The paper is available on the Terner website, and we've put the link to the full paper in the chat. As David mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic increased the urgency of the homelessness crisis and led the federal government to dedicate an unprecedented level of resources to mitigate its impact, including dollars that could be tapped to expand interim and permanent housing. The amount of funding, coupled with the speed by which it was deployed, provides an opportunity to learn more about best practices in adaptive reuse, as well as to explore if there are lessons from this moment that can inform the broader field of affordable housing. In our presentation today, Shazia is going to begin with an overview of the research and our methods. She will share lessons learned related to property selection and the types of buildings that are best suited for conversions. She will also touch on land use regulations and how local and state governments can create a regulatory environment that can make conversions a more viable strategy. Then, Hayden will share what we learned about approaches and challenges to financing conversions, as well as the importance of partnerships in successful projects. Shazia?
Thank you, Carolina. Our goal with this project was to better understand how policymakers and government agencies can help scale acquisition and conversion strategies in order to increase the supply of affordable housing with a focus on chronic homelessness. To do this, we interviewed staff at government agencies, service providers, developers, and industry experts. Our report features an in-depth analysis of 13 projects in 12 cities across the country and highlights opportunities and challenges that these projects faced. We chose projects that we felt were diverse in terms of geography, real estate markets, funding sources, and project status. Our interviews focused on financing, the institutional partnerships that helped projects get off the ground, and how project leads were thinking about long-term operations and service provision for residents. The majority of the projects we profiled were being converted into permanent supportive housing, or PSH. However, local needs factored into the decision-making process around final use, and 4 of the 13 projects anticipate operating as emergency shelter for the foreseeable future. For example, the Sleepy Inn in Missoula was acquired to be non-congregate shelter during the pandemic. Eventually, the property will either be redeveloped in accordance with the local planning process or will be sold, with proceeds going into an affordable housing trust fund. While built for residential use, not all hotels are ready for long-term occupancy. Extended stay hotels are generally well suited because they typically include kitchenettes and multi-room layouts. The Santa Fe Suites, for example, was already structured as studio apartments and required minimal updating, allowing the city to complete the conversion in 6 weeks. The property was also originally built as part of a planned development with easy access to a shopping center, a bike path, and a train station. A grocery store next door has even provided job opportunities to residents. But interviewees were cautious not to minimize the time and investments needed for conversion projects. For example, older hotels built before ADA codes were established can require significant upgrades. Fire codes may differ for property used for long-term occupancy, which can require further renovations, such as to sprinkler systems. Mercy Housing faced unanticipated structural problems during the renovation of the Capitol Park Hotel, downtown Sacramento's largest single-room occupancy residential hotel, which was originally built in 1912. While interviewees considered location when selecting sites, access to resources was given varying degrees of importance in purchasing decisions. The organizations we spoke with had to balance access to transit, grocery stores, and other resource questions against the urgent need to increase the number of rooms available and the availability of properties on the market. On average, case study properties were located in neighborhoods with high poverty rates relative to the surrounding geographies, but on par with new construction of PSH. Local land use regulations are cited as one of the biggest barriers to conversions because they can delay project timelines and drive up the cost of development. Local regulations differ between residential and commercial properties, for example, in terms of height restrictions, density requirements, and minimum unit square footage. This can prevent full use of a property once rezoned. Most of our interviewees said that they do not pursue projects that they know will require rezoning. For example, in Vermont, the Champlain Housing Trust chose to work within existing zoning rules when they converted a 100-room inn into 68 housing units. Reducing the number of units allowed them to avoid having to go through a higher level of review, as well as potential delays in appeals. Levels of community opposition differed between projects that we profiled, in some cases simply because of a property's location. In Brockton, the roadway inn was close to transit and grocery stores, but further away from residential neighborhoods, which limited opposition. Expedited timelines that came with the use of COVID relief funds also allowed many projects to fly under the radar and avoid scrutiny. Still, opposition stalled certain projects. For example, as Matthew Molika will discuss, proposed conversion of the Candlewood Inn and Suites in Austin spurred lawsuits and state legislation aimed at increasing barriers to hotel conversions overall. State laws that streamline conversions made a significant impact, especially in California and Oregon. AB 83, the statute that created HomeKey, included a CEQA exemption and made all HomeKey projects eligible for streamlining. Mercy Housing cited the CEQA exemption as critical in their ability to acquire and convert the Woodspring Suites into the La Mancha project, which will provide permanent housing in South Sacramento. In Oregon, HB 3261 excluded hotel and motel purchases for the purpose of shelter or low-cost housing from local land use challenges, which allowed previously stalled projects to move forward despite community opposition. Also in Oregon, HB 4212 required local governments to approve applications for emergency shelters, regardless of land use laws.
Thanks, Shazia. Dedicated and flexible funding facilitated by federal COVID-19 relief funds was a key factor scaling the number of conversions during the pandemic. But state and local programs also deployed flexible capital quickly. California and Oregon established statewide programs, HomeKey and Turnkey, which targeted federal resources for conversions, but also provided additional state funding. And King County, Washington, passed a 0.1% sales tax to finance permanent supportive housing projects. One of the key benefits of hotel-motel conversion is that these properties can be more cost-effective and can come online faster than new construction. Local market conditions still vary. As you can see here, acquisition costs in this study ranged from $32,000 per door in Missoula, Montana, to $206,000 per door in Seattle, Washington. But this range is on average much lower than the cost of developing a typical affordable housing unit. In California, early analysis of the state's HomeKey program found that average cost per unit was almost $300,000 cheaper than typical. But property quality really matters. With adaptive reuse, total development costs can rise substantially with unexpected rehab expenses. With Fusion Studios in Denver and Susan's Place in Vermont, good quality properties meant that total development costs were not much higher than acquisition costs alone. But in the case of the Capitol Park Hotel in Sacramento, significant rehab costs ended up bringing the project in line with typical LIHTC project cost in California. Capital funding aside, financing for long-term operations and services remains the biggest challenge facing conversion projects. As you can see here, residents in permanent supportive housing properties tend to have very low incomes, often less than 15% of area median income, meaning that rents are too low to cover operating expenses. Interviewees expressed deep concern over the lack of operations funding. King County's model supports operations by requiring that 50% of the proceeds of its sales tax be used for operations and services. But interviews highlighted the need for additional project-based vouchers or PBVs, which guarantee a steady stream of income to support operations. PBVs, however, require careful coordination with a local public housing authority, and they're limited in supply. Federal regulations limit the share of vouchers that can be project-based, so many projects were therefore unable to access them. Medicaid waivers, too, offer a promising potential source for expanded operations and services funding, but administrative and logistical barriers make these waivers also difficult to access. Conversion projects sit within broader complex systems of property development, of care coordination, of homelessness response, and these systems don't always work very well together. Interviews pointed to the need for strong partnerships to bridge expertise between developers and service providers, and to connect early with city departments like fire safety and transportation planning. Conversion projects sit within continuums of care, and most rely on coordinated entry systems of prioritization and referral to occupy their units. However, some projects, like Denver's Fusion Studios, seek to balance traditional coordinated entry with other strategies. Fusion Studios targets populations at the origin point of homelessness, those exiting hospital and prison systems onto the street, rather than waiting for folks to become unhoused and to rise to the top of the coordinated entry waiting list. Lastly, homelessness response systems have historically failed to address racial inequity in both prevention and response, and have failed to include a diverse range of providers at the table. Interviewees highlighted challenges with designing effective services for unhoused folks also facing the trauma of racism or of transphobia. And many projects struggled to afford the scope and scale of service provision they felt would be truly responsive. Many projects worked hard to engage providers of color or LGBT providers in their projects, but ultimately culturally responsive service provision remains an ongoing challenge.
Thank you, Hayden. The research presented by Shazia and Hayden highlights some lessons that are unique to conversions. For example, the importance of property selection and due diligence. But in the end, conversions are embedded within the broader funding and regulatory framework for affordable housing, meaning that the lessons and policy recommendations coming out of this research are applicable to more than just adaptive reuse. The first lesson is that the existing fragmentation in affordable housing finance adds time and complexity, meaning that it is poorly suited to moving quickly to acquire underutilized buildings. The case studies and the launching of programs such as HomeKey in California point to the value of having flexible, single source grants to acquire properties for affordable housing. Eliminating the need to put together a complicated capital stack can speed up development timelines and lower costs. The direct grant structure also allowed a greater range of organizations to participate in housing development. Policymakers should consider how to consolidate or better align existing funding streams to reduce this fragmentation, as well as to expand the funding toolkit for acquisition and rehab projects. Second, the lack of funding for the operations of permanent supportive housing consistently emerged as the greatest risk to the financial sustainability of these projects, as well as to resident outcomes. The expansion of vouchers at the federal level remains a critical priority. Absent that, policymakers should explore strategies to expand PBV authority, incentivize stronger coordination and prioritization of project-based vouchers at the local level, as well as make it easier to use Medicaid waivers for supportive services. Third, regulatory streamlining, both at the local and federal level, is the key ingredient for expanding supply and housing people more quickly. California and Oregon provide examples of model legislation at the state level, and HUD should consider extending or making permanent some of the waivers they instituted during the pandemic. But as Christina Moon will highlight in her presentation, there are still regulatory barriers and frictions between local and federal policies which need to be addressed. Finally, while the research is clear about the effectiveness of PSH in addressing chronic homelessness, there is still a lot to be learned about how to best target supportive housing, as well as how to fund and deliver services at the property level. Interviews highlighted the importance of partnerships and bridging the cultural divide between organizations that have expertise in housing and those that provide culturally responsive services. Incentivizing these partnerships, as well as strengthening the field's capacity to address racial and other disparities, would help support the development of a stronger, more equitable homelessness response system. Thank you. We look forward to the other panelist presentations and the discussion.
Thank you, Carolina, and to Shazia and Hayden for a fantastic presentation. For anyone who is interested in seeing the full report, Hayden dropped a link into the chat. It's also available on our website. So next, I'm going to pass it over to Mary Tingerthal, who worked with the National Alliance to End Homelessness on a very complimentary report. So Mary, please tell us what you found in your work.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm going to take just a minute to share my screen here. Thank you, everyone. And what I'll talk about today is derives from some work that I did last year with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And we were fortunate to learn partway through that work that the Terner Center was undertaking their work. And we agreed from the very beginning to collaborate on that work. And you'll find that the case studies that were included in the National Alliance work have almost no overlap with the Terner Center case studies. So a nice combined set of case studies for all of you to look at. Last year, the National Alliance, actually in 2020, became very curious about a couple of the initiatives that were going on around the country. Converting hotels to housing was something that hadn't happened a lot in the past. And they wanted to know whether it made sense as a policy to advocate for. So I started my work interviewing folks around the country that were doing these conversions with CARES Act money, and it allowed the one and resulted in a couple of important programs, including the Home ARP program, which I will in a minute. Also, state and local relief funds were part of the ARP legislation for your use. Those case studies, the link is shown here, and we can put that in the chat as well. I want to point out that there are both program level case studies for 3 states and 1 county. And project level case studies do go into a fair amount of detail. I noticed some questions in the about average cost, what portion was rehabilitation, what was acquisition, detail, as well as contact people for each of the projects and the programs. We also worked with the National Housing Conference last summer to broadcast presentations by many of these case study providers, and you can find those still on the NHC website with the link provided. So what are the key insights that we came away with? The first one may be a little bit surprising for those of you on the call who may be responsible for running programs and designing programs, and that is that programmatic guidelines are actually really, really helpful for developers. So they know exactly what kinds of populations you want to house, what you're willing to pay in terms of projects, what they're looking for in terms of service provision and development, and what types of housing they're willing to support. One of the common things was developers said that having access to commercial real estate expertise and contacts were really important in identifying suitable properties. Hayden mentioned that it makes a big difference in terms of the total cost as to the quality of the property and the type of conversion that needs to be done. And oftentimes, nonprofit developers and certainly service providers are not necessarily very experienced in how they go about finding properties like these. Also important to note that it's not just hotels, but there are examples of dormitories and convents and group homes that have been converted. So open your perspective to other properties that may have a low conversion cost because they already have bathroom facilities that are available to individual rooms. The next one, clear expectations about what populations are going to be served is really critical to buying the right properties. In the case studies, you'll see everything from single room occupancy projects for single adults, all the way to family units, sometimes with 2 and 3 bedrooms. And there are many, many different hotel and other properties, some of which suit some populations, some of which suit other populations. Really important to be careful about that. And finally, and you heard a lot about this from the Terner study, financial resources really have to be identified, not only for the capital expenses, but for ongoing operating costs. I'm going to just quickly go through a couple of high points from the Home ARP program and from the local example for King County, Washington. I mentioned that $5 billion has already been appropriated. This was part of ARP, not part of Build Back Better. So the money is in the bank, as they say. It has been allocated to state and local jurisdictions according to the home formula and really doesn't take into account the number of homeless population in any area. Jurisdictions are currently developing allocation plans. And I really want to call to your attention, if you're thinking about using this resource and you haven't yet contacted your state or your cities about how they intend to use these funds, I suggest you do that very soon. The guidance was published in September of last year. There isn't a hard deadline for how long localities and states have to submit their allocation plans, but they are required to go through a fairly lengthy process of community engagement in deciding how to utilize these dollars. And they are available for activities that have not traditionally been eligible under the regular home program. So it is an important source of extra dollars that can be used in the manner that Carolina mentioned, where you may use these dollars for essentially the entire funding of projects, which some jurisdictions are doing. A big difference is that it does allow for the development of non-congregate shelter, which are shelters that have separate rooms with bathroom facilities. That's the definition that HUD landed on. Unfortunately, the dollars cannot be used to fund operating costs for non-congregate shelter. However, in the rental housing section, it is possible to use the Home ARP dollars to actually establish a operating reserve, which is something that has really never been available through home funds before. It also allows the provision of supportive services, not so much operating expenses, but supportive services and tenant, and it can also be used for tenant-based rental assistance under guidelines similar to tenant-based rental assistance for the regular home program. Qualifying populations, you must have people who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, or fleeing violence in a number of categories. There are some provisions for other populations, but they're pretty prescribed. I really do suggest, if you're thinking about the home program as a resource for developing housing for people who are homeless or risk of homelessness, that you go to the HUD Exchange website. They have a lot of materials there. And frankly, the regulations are pretty complicated. So get familiar with them and figure out if they really are a source that your organization or your community may want to be using for acquiring properties and converting them either into rental housing or non-congregate shelter. Finally, just a little more detail on the program that Hayden mentioned, the King County housing program. This was enabled by a state law that allows local jurisdictions to choose to dedicate a 0.1% sales tax for housing on themselves. King County estimates that in their case, King County includes Seattle, it will generate about $60 million in revenue in 2021, with amounts going up over the following 20 years. The legislation allows for the local jurisdiction to bond up to 50% of that revenue to be used to repay the bonds. They plan to issue $350 million in bonds for the capital costs, both acquisition and rehab. And the balance of the revenue from the sales tax has to be used to fund operations. I was really impressed. This was the only program that I ran across in my research that looks at providing a funding source for both the capital costs and for operations. Their focus is very much health through housing, and this is an initiative that was started before the pandemic, and they target individuals and households with incomes less than 30% AMI. The goal is, and they're well on their way to completing this goal, is to create 1,600 units of permanent supportive housing by the end of this year. The program was kicked off just about a year ago right now. They really have a terrific model for partnering with local communities. They found that they really needed to do work up front in identifying properties in order to get buy-in from the communities where they were developing this permanent supportive housing. So consultation on site selection, joint selection of sites with the service providers that are going to be operating the properties. They do have a provision that overrides their normal continuum of care priority list that allows for 15% local referrals from the community where the property is located. And they also have devised what they call a good neighbor agreement, which talks to the community about what to expect in terms of management and behavior of people occupying the property. So really worth looking at, and encourage you to consider that if you're looking at some longer term solutions where maybe you do have the kind of atmosphere in your state or your community where some sort of dedicated resource may be in the cards for providing this kind of housing. And with that, my contact information, and I will turn it back to David.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that fantastic presentation. And again, to the Terner Center team on some work that I think is going to be hugely impactful as we think about future iterations of these strategies and policies. As we can see, there is some real potential in this strategy of converting and acquiring motels and hotels into affordable and supportive housing. But to dig into what it means to realize that potential and what the challenges are, again, we have a fantastic panel lined up. So I'd like to bring my panelists into the conversation here. So we're gonna we got just really quickly Matthew Molika from Austin with the Ending Community Homelessness Coalition, Christina Moon from the City of Oakland, and Amy Anderson of Wells Fargo. So question for all three of you is really just to start, if you can give us a really 5,000-foot view of the work that you do in this space, and then we can kind of jump into the question of potential, but also the issue of the challenges you face too. So we'll start, Matthew, we'll start with you. If you can tell us a little bit about your work in this space.
Great, thanks. So ECHO is the Continuum of Care lead agency for Austin Travis County. So we are, we run the coordinated entry system, the homeless management information system, or HMIS, and are responsible for sort of the strategic direction of the work here to end homelessness in Austin Travis County. So we work really closely with our local government, obviously the federal government, HUD, and the service providers doing the work on the ground to end homelessness. And like I mentioned, I got my start in Denver and was actually part of the Fusion Studios work mentioned before, prior to coming down here to Austin to do some work on hotel conversions here.
Thank you, Matthew. Christina, can you tell us a little bit about the work you've done in Oakland?
Sure, thank you, David. So I was sort of the lead project manager once Home Key was released in California in 2020. And we were really aggressive and tried to take advantage of this new resource. So we secured 4 awards in the first round of Home Key. 3 deals went forward, and they had quite a range of uses. One was a former dorm building that was in a really high opportunity neighborhood called Rockridge in Oakland. And the city ended up purchasing that directly, which I can talk more about why we would never do that again. And the second project was in at Temescal, which is a former small motel that had some recent renovation, and that was repurposed into a homeless veterans property. And a last model was Back's Project Reclamation, which is 15 single family and duplex homes that were kind of scattered throughout East and West Oakland, created into a scattered site model where the rooms were split up into rentals as sort of a modern SRO approach. This year, we submitted 6 applications. So we're trying to expand that pipeline even further. We're requesting over 160 million in Home Key capital. We'll see where that goes. We're still waiting to hear back from the state. And if awarded, we would have over 600 units in our pipeline.
Thank you, Christina. As a former resident of Rockridge, it's actually really exciting to see that project take shape. So thank you. And then Amy, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk a little bit about the work you do with Wells, as well as supported a lot of these innovations and projects. So please tell us a little bit more about Wells's involvement.
Yeah, thanks, David. So by way of background, I would share that in 2019, Wells Fargo made a commitment to invest $1 billion philanthropic dollars over 5 years towards housing affordability. And one of the 4 areas of focus for that philanthropy is supporting innovative and ideally transformative approaches to increasing production of homes that are affordable, and certainly hotel conversions falls squarely in that area. So last year, Wells made a series of, I think what we hope will be strategic grants in different parts of the country to help to further explore hotel conversions. And I would highlight specifically for conversion to permanent affordable housing. We were not supporting initiatives or projects that focused on the use of hotels for non-congregate shelter. And these grants are supporting housing providers to explore a variety of challenges and issues, everything from identifying and securing sites to addressing regulations and how to approach design and program objectives. I think I would just share that I think as Mary and the Terner team highlighted, for us, the interest in these grants, and this strategy really came about because of the opportunity in the downturn in the hospitality industry, but quickly shifted to recognizing that there was the real amazing opportunity was coming from the unprecedented government subsidies that were being dedicated to this strategy. So we really wanted to make sure that the affordable housing community could take advantage of those resources.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all 3 of you for that really quick synopsis of the great work you're doing. So let's talk a little bit about the experiences you've had on the ground. It's clear from the work from the Terner Center and Mary that when the stars align, that this could be a really powerful way to create housing quickly, particularly when you compare it to how long it takes to build traditional supportive or affordable housing. So I'd like to hear from each of you, like what has worked well so far? Tell us about the successes, and then we'll get into the challenges. So hold on to those for now. But Matthew, I'd love to hear from you what the experience has been for your group.
Yeah, so I think, ECHO in our role, had a unique position around, coalition building and strategic sort of alignment of resources across the continuum of care here in Austin, Travis County. And so one of the things that's gone really well for us is the ability for our community to help piece together capital dollars, which we actually used general obligation bonds for most of the capital that was done in rehab. So purchase and rehab. And then we were able to work with our housing authority, the city of Austin, housing authority of Travis County here to provide project-based rental assistance and RFP out project-based rental assistance to create permanent supportive housing in those hotel units. And so that was a unique opportunity for us to be able to say, okay, we have a resource coming on. We have capital dollars here. We have operating dollars here. We could merge those two things. And then the city of Austin, through the Austin Public Health Department, actually committed through their general fund to provide supportive services to the organizations that are doing the project. So we have committed and ongoing operating support, committed and ongoing supportive service dollars for these projects. And it was really great to sort of, be at the sort of hub of being able to help that alignment get into place. So that's gone really well here. We've had really strong, both political and community will to see an increased number of project-based permanent supportive housing units. When I got to Austin about 2.5, 3 years ago now, there were a total of 50 project-based permanent supportive housing units in Central Texas, and right now we have in our pipeline a little over 700. So I think there's a change and a recognition of the need, and it's got broad community support, and that's been a big success for us.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Christina, your experience in Oakland across a kind of a spectrum of different types of projects falling under HomeKey. We'd love to hear what's worked well with HomeKey. In the context of the experience you've had with your handful of projects and maybe some of the lessons you might carry forward to make future projects successful as well.
Yeah, so HomeKey, as Amy mentioned, it's just this giant flood of money, right, out onto the streets in California. And so having this really big statewide allocation of the coronavirus relief funds that the state received directly from Treasury, it's not like regular HUD money. It allowed them to have a little more state control over the program development. So there isn't the kind of Davis-Bacon, like certain requirements. NEPA is not required under the HomeKey program. So it was a state flavored program that really motivated every jurisdiction to really try to take advantage of the leveraging dollars that the state was offering. And with that, I think Hayden mentioned a lot of the streamlining that was written into the state kind of codes are incredible, right? So having the scale across the state to say most acquisition rehab projects under HomeKey are categorically exempt from CEQA is super powerful when you're trying to, and land use streamlining as well, no discretionary permit approvals required. So, it's kind of like a as of right approach to housing and homelessness that is not traditionally available to our industry. So that's been really powerful in that way. I would also say the urgency of the timeframes combined with the depth of funding available really made it possible to use that urgency to whip our departments into shape. So, I'm sort of an in-house advocate, right? Like our department is the capital kind of subsidy agency for housing. We worked really closely with the Human Services Department. So, mostly the department that works on the interim housing side, we've knit together our resources to say, how can we not lose out on this chance to do more housing quickly. And at the same time, we also pulled together our partners in planning and building, code enforcement, fire. Look, these projects are coming down the line. What are we doing to streamline their approvals? It's not perfect, and we can get into that too, but it was the ability to point to this program and say, we have to do this. It's a citywide effort, and you cannot opt out as a city agency from this effort. That was really powerful for us.
Interesting. It sounds like part of the secret sauce, if you will, for California has been kind of an intentional top-down policy push to make not just the dollars get out the door, but the projects themselves move quickly and successfully. As we'll get into in a little bit, that's not the case everywhere. But just really quick before we get into that, Amy, I think from you are well positioned to look across a lot of different home key acquisition projects, and so we'd love to hear from your perspective what has been the real success story so far.
Is it okay for me just to say ditto to whatever Christina said?
Amy, it is up to you.
Yeah, I mean, she really highlighted some important stuff. I think I really appreciate the Terner report lifting up that the things that have been working well for hotel conversions and the lessons learned are things that can be applied to affordable housing programs generally, and are really not narrowly lessons learned related to hotel conversions. The regulatory flexibility from a land use perspective in California was so key, and I think it's a contrast to, I know that the state of New York created a funding program called Honda. I think it was specifically targeted towards New York City, $100 million, one application for that program. And I think that speaks very loudly. That program did not include regulatory relief from what I think are even more complex regulations in the city of New York. Flexibility in the financing programs itself, making available, even though it was very short term, recognizing that rental subsidies were really key to the program. So these are all great successes that I think California incorporated into its program. I think one other thing I would highlight, and I think Mary kind of touched on this, these hotel assets are not always going to be the real estate asset that is available in the marketplace at an accessible and affordable price, so that this model continues to be ideal. But certainly the landscape around different types of real estate assets is changing. And I think, there is great opportunity to leverage the lessons that are being learned specifically around reuse of existing buildings into adaptive reuse generally for all sorts of buildings. Mary identified a few, but there's also, going to be exploration around office buildings and retail, and I think all sorts of, I don't think warehouses yet, but maybe someday we'll get there. So.
Thanks, Amy. So you have a lot to add in addition to what Christina said. So I just have one more question before we throw it to Q&A, but really want to dig into the really unique challenges you faced in some of these projects, and really how those challenges have informed how you're approaching future acquisition projects, right? So on one thing, what has just been difficult to work through, but then just if you had the opportunity to speak to a local or state policymaker, what would you say to them needs to change in order for your projects to be successful in the future? Amy, we'll start with you. I think you have some unique insights here.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, I guess I would share that I think some of my insights were really gained from when I was in the mayor's office and trying to implement that original version of HomeKey, and then continued conversations with colleagues and others throughout the state. There are, I think, a couple of specific challenges that the Wells Fargo grants in this area were intended to try and tackle. One is a recognition that affordable housing developers were not and are not the only ones in the marketplace trying to buy these properties, and that in many cases, affordable housing developers and cities like Christina are competing with market rate actors who inevitably have more money and can act with much more aggressively and with more speed. So part of our grants were designed to try and give affordable housing developers the dollars that they needed to act a little bit more like those market rate actors, to be aggressive in terms of the purchase terms and the deposit amounts, so that, you know, ideally they were successful in securing the properties that they wanted to secure. I think another challenge that was confronted in the early programs in California and the different programs that Mary's case study highlighted was that those programs were funded oftentimes by the coronavirus relief funds in the CARES Act, which came with these really strict timelines that often meant that purchases were being made really quickly and that people didn't always know what they were getting. So I think another key issue that the Wells grants tried to address was making sure that folks had dollars to do the due diligence to either confirm that they were buying a good quality product or that they kind of clearly understood the crap they were that they were getting into, right? It's okay to buy these properties that maybe aren't in great shape, but what is really important is that you've done the physical needs assessment and maybe engaged a contractor to understand what the scope of work is going to be and what the potential cost is going to be. So those are just I think a couple of key challenges.
Thanks, Amy. And Matthew, in our prep call, we talked about a lot of the challenges you faced. And so if you can kind of walk us through some of those, interesting juxtaposition between what you have in front of you in Austin, Texas versus kind of what we're seeing with Home Key in California. So please tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think clearly what we're dealing with here in Texas is, really highly politicized debate and around homelessness and who experiences it and why. And so, during the process of implementing some of these conversions, we saw our state legislature pass a statewide camping ban, House Bill 1925, which made it illegal to camp in any public spaces across the state. They also took up legislation in the House to make it more difficult to actually do these hotel conversions to permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness by requiring not only a vote and acceptance by the city municipality, so through city council or the strong mayor process, but also requiring a majority vote of the county commissioners in the county where the site would be or where the project would be sited, and also requiring us to post in the local newspapers about where the site is, what its intended use is, hold significant open dialogue with the community, which of course is really important, but also lends itself to some of the concerns around NIMBYism of the project. And I think, we've had and continue to struggle with, this highly politicized nature here in Austin. And it has impacted, most of all impacted the people we're trying to serve experiencing homelessness in our community. And I think that's really the sad truth to not getting all these projects. We could have more projects off the ground by now because there's just such a need. But those are some of the things we've come across, and then just intense, community opposition on certain areas. So it's made it hard to cite future projects.
Thanks, Matthew. And I know there are certain, not just unique to Texas, there's certain proposed projects in California that even with everything that's been put in place there is a lot of pressure put on local officials to not move forward with these kinds of projects. But Christina, really quickly, with the couple minutes we have, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about some of the challenges you faced. You mentioned, maybe not owning something outright. So any other things that you want to lift up real quickly here before we end?
I try to keep it quick, but there's so many lessons learned that I can share more later if people want. So, like I mentioned, we really tried to build up our departments, like build that muscle so that we can all work together. And so we really had to create sort of an internal strike force to say, what are all the things we need to put in place so that this can work? Like close collaboration with HSD. How can we let's pool all our money together. What does that look like? Your operating money and my capital money, not requiring kitchens in hotel motel conversions, and just say, look, we are grandfathering in the certificate of occupancy, and we are putting this in writing internally amongst our departments so that we can agree how we're treating all these projects. We will never directly acquire again. It's really hard as a city to do that. And we're not developers or good property owners. So I think we have reverted back to creating a system where we're just a funder, but we are really trying to implement policy through our funding. And we tried to be way more proactive with the housing authority this round. I think last round it's too fast, didn't really allow us to do that. But they are meeting our requests with a really innovative kind of strategy as a moving to work agency by providing capitalized operating subsidy in a way that, is sort of more affordable for them and, doesn't rely on the full like HAP contract approach. And I would say that part of the challenges that we're seeing is, perfect being the enemy of good. We have a different kind of subset of developers that we're working with than we typically do. It's not kind of our bread and butter nonprofit group. It's folks that are sort of willing to take a little more risk perhaps and ready to execute and deliver on an accelerated schedule. So, are you willing to take 10 years of operating instead of a 15-year HAP with an automatic extension, and a lot of developers are very uncomfortable with that. So we are kind of creating new partnerships through this. We also try to facilitate, but not matchmake, new teams that would, allow service providers to work with developers so that they can meet the minimum requirements of home key. Similarly, like creating a list of city-owned sites and interested sellers that are reaching out to us and kind of making that available for everyone to look at. And I would just say, moving forward, I think everyone knows this, we just need more operating money. Like there's just, like the state issued so many, like millions, billions of dollars, but like 100 million or 50 million in operating subsidy, it makes no sense. It's an unfunded mandate. We're trying to innovate as much as possible, but, we kind of stretched what we had with the, state HAP money and the housing authority. And now that we're running into NEPA challenges, it's just really hard to execute fast projects and respond to the emergency that is homelessness unless we have that kind of federal streamlining that the state has issued, as well as deeper operating subsidy resources.
Thanks, Christina. Clearly, we were right at time. Clearly, this is a topic we could spend a lot of time on. Thank you to the team at Terner Center, to Mary for her great work on this too. I just want to say, if you've enjoyed this conversation, we have more coming very soon. Again, we have a research paper on home key specifically coming out very soon. To be the first to have this in your inbox, please feel free to sign up for the Terner Center newsletter. I think we're going to drop that into the chat now. Again, want to thank our collaborators at the Housing Crisis Research Collaboration. And again, we have, don't forget to claim your 1 hour of CM credit for APA members. But again, I just want to close by saying thank you to all of the panelists and to everyone who's done the great research on this. And we look forward to having another conversation about this very, very soon. So thank you all very much for your time and for your work. And thank everyone for joining us today.